two, one.
Hey you guys, today Bella and I would like to talk to you about the Great Depression and what caused the Great Depression in the United States and the impact that it had, um, stuff like that. So when we say Great Depression, we're referring to a period of time that started in 1929 when our US economy really slowed down. It means that people were struggling to buy and sell goods, that a lot of people were unemployed. So actually, like a country's economy going through different periods of slowing down and speeding up and being better or worse, that's actually part of a normal business cycle. But when it becomes a depression is when that normal cycle is longer and more severe than in the past, which is going to be what happened during the Great Depression. So our first question is going to be what caused the Great Depression? So we are just coming out of World War One. We are just coming out of the 1920s, a period of like really massive wealth in the United States. That's not necessarily true worldwide because in Europe, their economies had been devastated from the war. They had borrowed a bunch of money from the United States and they were struggling to pay back that debt. So countries in Europe were going to start going into their own Great Depressions for sort of different reasons than the United States ends up going through their own depression. But one of the problems was that we relied on trade with Europe. And when Europe started going through their sort of struggle, they were having a hard time paying us back. And we also passed high tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods because we wanted people to buy US goods instead of European goods because that was good for our economy. But the problem was that when Europe wasn't making money from us, they couldn't buy our stuff then. So because we weren't buying their stuff, they couldn't buy our stuff. So that's going to end up hurting us as well because we, like I said, we really relied on that trade from Europe. Another problem is that people were borrowing money to invest in the stock market and buying risky stocks because they thought they might make a bunch of money. So just I'm not going to get super into the way that the stock market works in this video, but kind of just to summarize, if you don't know, um, when you buy a stock, it's sort of like buying a little piece of a company. You don't get to like have any say about that company, but if it's sort of a way for the company to borrow money from you. So they cut their corporation to a bunch of tiny little pieces and they sell off tiny little pieces of their company. And those pieces of their company, when their company is doing well, those pieces of their company become more valuable. When their company is struggling, those pieces of their company become less valuable. So what people do is they'll buy a stock in something. Let's say, actually, my husband got some stock in Starbucks because he used to work for Starbucks. So you buy a stock at a certain price, and in that way, you're investing in the company because the company gets the money that you've invested in their stock. Let's say down the road you decide that you want to get rid of that stock. The value of that stock changes moment by moment based on how much of it people are buying or selling. It's kind of a weird thing. But when you sell it, you're either going to make money on that stock because it has become more valuable, or you're going to lose money on that stock because it becomes less valuable. So in the 1920s, people were like imagining that the stock market, like they were trying to figure out which companies are going to do well and which stocks are going to go up in value. And some of those stocks were really risky stocks. So another thing that people were doing is what's called buying on margin. So speculation is when you like invest in risky stocks. Buying on margin is when you borrow money from the bank to invest in the stock market. Now that's illegal. However, at the time, it wasn't illegal. That was something people were doing. Um, so the problem is that it kind of messes with the price of stocks. So if just anybody can like borrow money to invest in the stock market, then you you're not going to get the true value of those stocks because you have more money invested in the stock market than should be. you don't need to understand all of that, but just kind of like that's the big idea. So people were borrowing money from the bank to invest in these risky stocks, and then if something happened and um, the stock that they bought ended up not being valuable, like they lost money, they would not be able to pay the bank back. So this is going to end up leading to bank failures. So I've got a little picture of that here, where because people couldn't pay their loans back to the bank, then the banks couldn't give the people who had put their savings in the bank, they couldn't give that money back to the people. So that's going to cause banks to close down, and then ultimately it will cause like people to panic and go try to pull their money out, and it's going to be a huge problem. Okay, so another problem is that there was this they had way overproduced goods. So in the 1920s there were some really rich people, but there were also a lot of really poor people. And really poor people have a harder time buying the stuff that they need, and rich people don't spend all their money. Okay, if that makes sense. So sometimes rich people, if they're not investing their money somehow, they're not good for the economy, because a healthy economy has to be moving. So a healthy economy, there just has to be money being spent. Because when I spend my money to buy a product, the people who made that product make money. So the workers who made that product, and the workers who made that product will use their money to buy other stuff, and it just causes that flow and that healthy economy. So the problem was like we had way overproduced stuff in our factories, so the factories had to start laying off workers. But because they laid off workers, it caused this domino effect where workers were not able to buy the stuff that they needed, and the really rich people weren't spending enough money. So it's just going to cause this domino effect. It's going to end up making like farmers are going to start going out of business because they can't. It's going to drive the prices of crops down, because when you have too high of a supply and too low of a demand, it's going to drive prices down. So farmers can't pay back their loans. Workers are going to start getting replaced by machinery, but when the workers get fired, then and they can't get a new job, then once again, that's another person who can't spend money in the economy. Okay, another problem is that there was a Federal Reserve policy. The Federal Reserve is the bank that controls the US money supply. They did not control, um, they didn't control the amount of money that was being printed the way that they need to. So they needed to have regulations. Like now, our Federal Reserve Bank has a lot of regulations about what banks can do and like what they can loan, and on interest rates and stuff like that. But the Federal Reserve was not limiting the money supply so that they could fix the economy. So again, that's a little bit complicated, but that you can just know the big idea. And then all of this is going to finally lead to the big problem, which was that in 1929, the stock market crashed on Black Tuesday. So it was October 29th of 1929. It was called Black Tuesday. Um, and what happened is that the stock market started dropping, like, and then people panicked and started selling their stocks. And the more they sold their stocks, like their stocks became worth less and less and less. So and then that triggers like a chain reaction, because um, it was driving all these businesses out of business, because basically all of their investors pulled their investments out of their business by selling their stocks. And then because a lot of people had borrowed money, so they had been buying stocks on margin, they couldn't pay the banks back the money that they had borrowed to invest in the stock market. That's going to cause the banks to shut down. People are going to panic and try to pull their money out of the bank, but when everybody runs and tries to pull their money out of the bank can't survive and cannot like give back all the money that's owed. So that's going to cause like that is going to be the official start of the Great Depression. So a lot of it just was caused by people panicking and um, pulling their money out of the stock market and out of the banks. Okay, so that's kind of a summary of how the Great Depression started. Um, so the next question we want to just quickly go over before we get into the real meat of it is like, what was life like during the Great Depression? And I think we could use a lot of different words to describe what life was like, but let's just say that it was super difficult. Um, it was the highest unemployment rate that I think the United States has ever had. So in 1928, unemployment was 4%. And then by 1933, 25% of the labor force was unemployed. That's unbelievable. And actually, the Great Depression was worldwide. It was hunger, poverty, unemployment. It started actually in Europe before it came to the United States, but it does spread to the United States. Wages and prices fell. So actually, you guys, a lot of people think like, hey, it's a good thing when prices go down. When prices go down too much, it's a sign that economy is not healthy. Thousands of businesses went bankrupt, hundreds of banks failed. Foreclosures are going to force farm families off their land. There's going to be something called the Dust Bowl that lasts for about 10 years because farmers in like Oklahoma and Kansas had overfarmed their land when they were making a lot of money, and that's going to cause like massive dust storms and soil erosions. We're going to have a lot of people being homeless. Oops, I don't want to go there yet. We're going to have people being homeless. And you see the trains up here? Men would like sometimes run away from their families and become hobos and just hop on the train and see where the train would take them. Um, the government is going to end up having to step in and fix it. So, farmers were protesting the loss of their land and sometimes using violence to stop themselves from being evicted. Um, Veterans of World War I are going to go to Washington to request an advance on their payment. They're going to be called the Bonus Army. So they were supposed to get paid for World War One, but it wasn't supposed to happen until later, but they requested it early. And then they're going to end up fighting with police. So literally, Herbert Hoover is going to send the police out to attack World War One Army vets. It was ugly. Um, a lot of suicides. I don't know if I mentioned that. Soup kitchens and bread lines. So many people had to get government help because they were out of work. People started like lost their homes. So there were like in like large cities, people would set up camps of tents that people started calling Hoovervilles because they blamed President Hoover for not doing enough to fix the Great Depression. Um, Kids were running away from home and just kind of wandering around, looking for food and work. It was a very dark time in US history. Um, a lot of families were breaking up. Divorce rates were at an all-time high. People were not getting married because they thought they couldn't afford to be married. A lot of farmers started moving to California trying to get work as like um, farm help. The government started, like I said, the government started programs like the CCC, which stands for the Civilian Conservation Corps, to help young adults move from cities to find work in like conservation. So yeah, it was, like I said, a really difficult time. So that's kind of the overview of what caused the Great Depression, sort of like what life was like during the Great Depression. And now we're going to get into much more of the specific details about the Great Depression. Okay, so right before the stock market crashed in 1929, it was at an all-time high. And you can see that on this graph here, that right here is when it topped out, and then it's going to completely crash. So it reached like a crazy low here. So like I said, that like little up and down is part of the normal business cycle, but when it's longer and more severe, that is when you end up with a depression. Okay, so in the late 1920s, the United States was experiencing a bull market. So I always get my students to remember that the difference between a bull market and a bear market, those are just two nicknames to describe what's happening with the stock market. When it's a bull market, the stock market is going up. You can remember it like a bull is charging forward. Most people never believed that a bear market was going to happen. A bear market is when the economy and the stock market slows down and begins to drop. I kind of help students remember it by saying that bears are big and slow. They're really not slow, but if you can imagine that way. As I said, a lot of investors were buying on margins, so they were borrowing money from the bank and buying their stocks on credit, and they were speculating. In other words, they were putting money on high risk investments, hoping to make big profits, but that is going to end up coming back to bite them. So in 1929, the stock market is going to fall sharply. So it was October of 1929. So many speculators end up losing everything as stock prices fall, and then the nation is going to fall into a downward economic spiral called the Great Depression. So I made just this little graph here to help you understand what happens in a normal business cycle. So usually what is going to happen, oops, I got a little ahead of myself. Before I get to that, I want to talk about one more thing. So I was just describing like what was happening in the Great Depression starting. So after speculators are losing all their money, it's going to cause banks to collapse when the stock market collapsed because customers who had borrowed money couldn't repay the loan. Do you guys know that when a bank loans out money, they take the money that other people put into the bank in their savings or checking accounts, and they loan out that's the money that they loan out. So I always love to diagram and show students that, do you know that you can create money using credit? But that's for another day. But when the banks couldn't collect the money back from the people that had borrowed it, they were also not able to pay it back to the people who had put their own money into the bank. So, as a result of this, millions of investors lose their life savings that they had put into the bank as the banks failed. They are unable, also, people are unable to borrow money to start businesses or to support their businesses. So, this is going to cause thousands of businesses to fail as well. So, it's like a really ugly cycle. Okay, so here's my business cycle diagram that I made for you guys. So usually it starts when a factory finds that supply is greater than demand. So they've produced too much stuff. They're not selling all their stuff. They don't want to drop the prices too much. So they stop producing and they lay off workers. Consumers buy up all the extra products that were created before, and then the businesses are able to increase production and hire workers back. And so that's kind of how a normal business cycle works. The problem is that in the Great Depression, it was longer and more severe. So they were not able to rehire workers fast enough. The workers didn't have the money to buy the surplus, so we couldn't get that cycle started back up again. So the government is going to have to do something more severe to get that restarted. Okay, here's another little diagram I made to help show you the causes of the Great Depression. So like I said, there was way overproduction in the 1920s, which leads to large surpluses. And the problem was that the unequal distribution of wealth meant that poor people who usually Okay, so poor people are actually usually pretty good for the economy because they spend all their money. So they're the ones that you can rely on to spend money because they have to spend pretty much everything they have. Rich people can save their money. When you save your money, it's actually bad for the economy. I know it sounds weird, but um, so the problem is that by the late 1920s, businesses had way large surpluses and too few consumers. And don't forget, we still have the problem of high tariffs from the United States. So Europeans couldn't buy American stuff either. So we just have a bunch of stuff and there's nothing that we could do with it. Okay, so when the Great Depression hits home, unemployment skyrockets. State governments and charities could not keep up with the demand for services. Okay, so it's going to cause people to like kind of freak out, and there's going to be a lot of like riots and violence that happen in the United States. And one of the most famous things that happened is that the Bonus Army, I've got some pictures of them in here, a group of World War I soldiers, they were Army vets that were supposed to get paid for their service in Europe. They go to Washington, D.C. to protest and demand their payment early. So they camp out in front of the White House. You can see pictures of them. And rather than giving them what they want, which actually might have been good for the economy because those war vets could have spent their money and helped restart the economy, Herbert Hoover instead ordered federal troops to remove the Bonus Army, and it made him look really bad. I mean, when you, like, here's some pictures of them fighting. When you attack Army vets, it's not a good look for a president. So people blame Hoover a lot for not fixing the Great Depression. And part of that was that he had a core belief that, okay, the United States is a capitalist country. He really believed that the economy would just like naturally fix itself. So he kind of leaned more toward supporting businesses because he thought businesses would then be able to pick up and support the workers. But he didn't do enough and he didn't do it fast enough to fix the economy. He thought that voluntary efforts rather than federal assistance would end the crisis because he really didn't want to see a large government and he didn't want to see the government get that involved in the economy. He did approve something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which loaned money to businesses. Like I said, he believed that businesses were going to be the ones to solve the problem of the economy. But once again, it didn't work. Okay, so in comes FDR in 1932. So remember, this is 1929 when the Great Depression starts. So we've got 3 years of Hoover really not doing a whole lot of anything. So in 1929, the Democratic candidate is going to be Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, and he wins in a landslide victory against Hoover. His strategy is pretty much the opposite of Hoover's. He collects a group called the Brain Trust, and they're experts like college professors and labor leaders, lawyers, social workers, and he wanted them to give him advice on how to fix the economy. So what they came up with was something called the New Deal. He said that Americans didn't need a raw deal or a square deal, they needed a new deal, which was a bunch of government programs that were supposed to help with the Great Depression. However, the way those programs were going to work was that the government was going to have to use deficit spending to re-stimulate the economy, which, by the way, we still do now. That's a very common practice. We have been in deficit spending for quite some time. So deficit spending is when you borrow money or you spend money that you don't have. So the government had to spend money that they did not have. All right. So some of the New Deal programs that FDR used, he did a bunch, and he started with 100 days of reform. So one of the first things he did was he declared a bank holiday, which means that he asked for all banks to temporarily close so that the government regulators could make sure that each bank was in good financial condition. He also started doing something called fireside chats. So every week, FDR would get on the radio, which remember from the 1920s, like the majority of US households had radios in them. And he would just reassure Americans that things were going to be okay. Okay, that might sound like a little thing, but part of the economy is that people have to believe in it. So, like, when people think their economy is bad, they're not going to spend money. They're like, oh, I better save my money in case I need it for an emergency because our economy is bad. But when Americans believe the economy is good, they spend their money. So then, but when they spend their money, it makes the economy good. See how that works? So actually, those fireside chats were incredibly smart way to get the economy moving again. So as banks reopened, because Americans trusted FDR, they began depositing their money in the banks. And so those banks were able to get healthy again. Also, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration started giving states money directly to hand out to needy people. Again, this was not the style of the US government to do anything to like directly support social programs. It was just not anything we had done. That was completely new. Um, Also, the government through the New Deal started creating a bunch of jobs for Americans. So some of the things that they created were the Civil Works Administration, led by Harry Hopkins, and they hired people to do all kinds of things, like build airports, roads, sewers. They created something called the Tennessee Valley Authority to build dams to create hydroelectricity and flood control along the Tennessee River. By the way, a lot of those areas in Tennessee had never had electricity before. The National Industrial Recovery Act suspended antitrust laws so businesses could agree on wages and hours for their employees. You guys, this is not normal for the US government to mess around in the economy in that kind of way. Because in a free market or a laissez faire market, your government is supposed to leave it alone. Like, there is economic theory that says that economies should just naturally balance themselves out. So this is really not, this is a huge change from what the US government had ever done. They also created something called the Civilian Conservation Corps, which hired and actually helped transport young men from more like city areas to rural country areas um, to do like conservation work. And I think that's kind of cool because even the Menominee people were part of the Civilian Conservation Corps. A lot of Menominees worked on the Civilian Conservation Corps. They also, let me see, what am I missing? They, as part of the 100 Days of Reform, they also passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act to lower production, like to control how much crops farmers were producing, because if they lowered the amount of crops they produce, that would actually help raise the prices because it would decrease the supply so that the demand could help the prices rise. If you think about it, it will make sense, but you just have to think about what that means. And so they also created the Farm Credit Administration to give loans and help farms get refinanced so farmers wouldn't lose their farms. So all of these things were incredibly like invasive in some ways in the US economy, and a lot of people actually did not agree with it. So there were different critics of FDR. Some people said that he did too much, and some people said that he didn't do enough. So, one of the critics who said that the New Deal wasn't doing enough was Father Coughlin. He's right here on the left, and he said that that the government needed to take wealth and redistribute it, and that all wealth and resources should be owned by the government. It's really kind of a communist philosophy. Huey Long, on the other hand, was a Louisiana senator who thought that we should have more equal distribution of wealth. And some people said that that all of the New Deal programs and the stuff that FDR was like making the government way too powerful. It was becoming way too invasive in Americans' lives. Okay, so a bit later comes the Second New Deal. In 1934, Democrats were able to get more seats in Congress. So FDR knew that he would have more support if he wanted to pass more programs. So he added the Works Progress Administration, which paid millions more workers to build hospitals, parks, roads, and schools. And then he also passed the Social Security Act, which is one of the New Deal changes that still affect our economy. So that was supposed to provide government assistance to old people, children, Americans with disabilities, and people who couldn't get jobs. Once again, a lot of people felt that that was a huge overreach for the government, that the government went way too far in getting involved in the economy and Americans' lives, and that they should not have done that. All right, so this leads us to the election of 1936. So the Republican candidate was Alfred Landon, the governor of Kansas. The Democratic candidate was FDR, who again won in a landslide victory. But people were still criticizing and talking about the New Deal because, once again, this is something that had never been done before. So some people said that the New Deal didn't do enough to end the Great Depression and that it started a tradition of deficit spending where the government spends more than it takes in as income. That's not untrue. We do have that pattern of deficit spending now. However, a lot of people celebrated the New Deal and said that it prevented an economic and political collapse. And you guys, still to this day, like I said, we have some of the New Deal reforms like Social Security. Okay, but let's take a look and just talk about how this affected like everyday Americans. It had a heavy toll on people, especially on family life. A lot of families, especially people who lived in cities, lacked money for food, clothing, and shelter. Divorce rates skyrocketed. Marriage and birth rates fell. People were just afraid to have kids or get married. Kids a lot of times had to drop out of school to help support their families. Men would commit suicide or run away from their families because they felt ashamed they couldn't provide. But overall, families acted like a safety net, providing for members of their family who faced difficulties. Okay, we need to talk about the farmers in the Great Depression because they had it bad. Um, Prices fell so low for a while that farmers could not afford to even ship their products to market because they had way overproduced crops, so it caused the prices to fall. So whenever you have like too high of a supply and too low of a demand, that's going to make the prices fall. So a lot of farmers lost their farms to foreclosure, where the banks would have to take over ownership of the property and when the owner couldn't repay their loans. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of farmers would resort to violence to try to keep their land. Another horrible thing that happened to farmers, you can see a picture of this, was that a huge drought hit the Great Plains. So we're talking about like Kansas and Oklahoma and Nebraska, probably a little bit, maybe pieces of Missouri, I would say. But the problem was that they had like been making so much money on the wheat and things like that they used to farm that farmers way over farmed. So it sucked all the moisture out of the soil. And because they had plowed up all the grass so that they could use it to plant crops, whenever you remove the topsoil, it makes it so that you can have dust storms. Like it can cause soil erosion, which is exactly what happened. They literally had about 10 years of dust storms where dust I mean, they couldn't grow anything. Like people, it would just like the dust storms would make it almost impossible to breathe. It would be all over in their food. It would be in their house. It would just be everywhere. It was a really, really difficult time. And it's not only farmers who were suffering, but also people who were non-white especially had it hard. So Mexican immigrants, even Mexican Americans who were American born, um, a lot of people started getting deported because white people didn't want competition over jobs. Um, African Americans face even worse discrimination than usual, um, and they usually received lower wages than white Americans. They also face segregation in some New Deal programs. They received assistance from the government and they did give their support to President Roosevelt. And Roosevelt appointed African Americans to positions in his administration. He really wanted to fight against that. And FDR wasn't the only one who supported African Americans. His wife, Eleanor, um, was was really active in fighting for minority rights. So there's a story about Marian Anderson, who was a famous African American singer. She was supposed to perform a concert at a hall owned by the Daughters of the American Republic, which was like a women's group that Eleanor Roosevelt was part of. And when they told her that she couldn't sing there because she was black, Eleanor Roosevelt quit the group and arranged for Anderson to perform at the Lincoln Memorial, where literally thousands of people ended up showing up for this concert. Okay, so like I said, the government had provided a lot of programs that would hire people to do various jobs. And another one of those jobs that people did, paid for by the government, was write books and produce art. So the Federal Writers Project hired writers to create travel guides, oral histories, and folklore collections. Some of the most famous artists that wrote for the Writers Project included John Steinbeck. He's like right over here. A lot of his stories were about life in the Great Depression. He's famous for The Grapes of Wrath and also a book called Of Mice and Men and many other ones. Dorothea Lange, she was a photographer and she photographed rural life for the Farm Security Administration. So you can see her most famous photograph right here. When people talk about the Great Depression, this is usually the photograph that is used. It's so iconic. And that was paid for through the federal government. And then finally, Margaret Mitchell, she published a novel called Gone with the Wind. And that was just like a romance that was supposed to be sort of a distraction for people, to kind of forget about the difficulties of the Great Depression. Okay, and another way that people found relief from the Great Depression is through popular entertainment. At the time, like the most popular music was swing. We still have the jazz from the 1920s, which is going to kind of evolve into more of a swing. Gospel singers like Mahalia Jackson. Woody Guthrie was a popular folk singer. You can see him right over here, who sang about loss and struggle. Radio was still very, very important during the Great Depressions, and families would get together. Even my grandpa talks about remembering his family sitting around the radio and him going over to his neighbors, and they would sit around the radio at night and listen to programs and stories and music. And that was a really good way for people to kind of escape the difficulties of the Great Depression. And then movies. Movies were really cheap, and that was a really popular way for people to distract themselves from how difficult things were. So that's my summary of life in the Great Depression, the causes, some of the ways that it that the United States worked to get out of it, and ultimately what's going to for sure end the Great Depression is going to be World War II. That is what clinches it. That Bella's mad about the postman. Hey. So yeah, World War II is going to finally end the Great Depression once and for all because all of the weapons and supplies manufacturing for the war is going to really kickstart the U.S. economy back up again. So once again, the United States benefits from war. Pretty much the story of our existence. So that's my summary. I hope that was enlightening for you. Thank you, Bella, for your starring role.